Good morning, everybody. Here in the room and online. My name is Mark Moquet. I'm the China Knowledge Envoy for the Dutch government, working from foreign affairs with all other government ministries on getting to know our complex relationship with China. And I'm very happy to be able to speak very briefly on what this China network is doing, China Knowledge Network is doing, just before we start presenting this report on the standardization with Chinese characteristics, question mark. We'll learn about the question mark later. But this comes from the China Knowledge Network, and that is in and of itself quite unique. It's unique because we have all the government ministries collaborating on what we choose as a research program and how we think about our relationship with China. We have a double mandate. We produce and develop knowledge that is policy relevant, and we develop awareness of the relationship with China that is very complex, and you have to use other methods in order to understand each other there. I think one of the co-authors of this report, Maaike Okano-Heijmans, who is from the Klingendael Institute, she has worked with us on both sides of the fence in this research report and also in Cosmolab, one of our projects, to organize this thinking on the complexity of the relationship with China, which is meant to actually challenge our researchers over and beyond the research projects that we've tasked them with. And I think so far it is quite a success. Thank you for collaborating with us on that one, and hope to see you back on other ones. Also, the China Knowledge Network is expanding. We are trying to land in Brussels because we feel that there is a higher multiplier to be gained in Brussels, and we work together on that with counterparts from Sweden and Germany, the NKK, the Swedish China Center, and MERIX, which is a German think tank on China. We've already organized a couple of seminars in Brussels just last week on monetary structural changes regarding the internationalization of the renminbi, the Chinese currency. And I think this research piece is quite a good candidate to also take to Brussels and present there in front of the bureaucrats and try to enhance collaboration on this subject. So with that little introduction on the China Knowledge Network, I would like to ask Alexandra Gomez, one of the co-authors, to come to the fore and start presenting the seminar. I will be taking up my seat. I'm very much looking forward to this. I would like to note that we have record attendance, over 70 people in and out of the room. And one logistical remark for the people in the room: unfortunately, the windows don't open. We open the door, but then there's a beautiful poster really that you can watch from there. So wishing you a very good presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, and very happy to be here in front of you to present this report. I'm just one of 5 authors, as you see. Maaike Okano-Heijmans, our former colleague at Klingendael Medium, Sainato, Niels ten Hoover, our expert on the telecom and internet area, and Susan Lutke, who is attending online, and she also contributed a lot to this report with a particular focus on EV chips. We will have a look then at the highlights of the report. It's a rather large one, so I will focus on some of the highlights and key takeaways that we should, either as from the industry point of view or from the government point of view or from the research point of view, the biggest and most important takeaways from this report. And I will start with a bit of a boring bit, but to be very fast, I promise. The definition, because it's important to understand what you're talking about. Standards are documented and reproducible technical specifications. And normally they are voluntary, with a few exceptions. So this means that a standard defines the rules of engagement with a certain technology, and they effectively allow for interoperability, quality control, and safety measures. So this all sounds maybe a bit boring, but is actually the cornerstone and the key element if you want to understand how technologies, namely, work with each other. So if you own a standard, meaning if you are at the forefront of developing standards or patents which are related to standards, you effectively have a certain degree of control over the market. Standards are normally seen, and that's one of the biggest takeaways, I believe, from this research, as a very niche topic. It's very technical. It's about the little alineas describing how technology should work. But actually, they shape how trade and innovation and digital ecosystems are defined over time. So this is true for critical emerging technologies, but also for more mature technologies, as we'll see with the EV chips case study. Looking at China, and obviously this is a research on behalf of the China Knowledge Network, what we see is that China has moved from a standards taker to a standards innovator. And that has been done based on a very coherent strategy, which still lacks mostly in Europe. We have had historically a dominant position, but we have been losing some influence over time. And the question of whether that's a problem is what we'll be discussing today. If you look at China, you really have the playbook. So it's a state-oriented, state-backed power. And I would like to highlight this sentence, which really is the mantra that guides China policy on standardization. Third-tier companies make products, second-tier companies make technology, and first-tier companies make standards. If you replace companies by countries, you see how China wants to get an ever greater role in international standardization bodies. So you essentially see a state-led orchestration mechanism where policy, industry, research, state-supported research organizations, and even diplomacy are aligned to bring the Chinese standards to the world, but also to, when useful, learn from others. And they do it via different means. You have financial incentives and rewards that are provided by the national, but also by regional governments to companies that engage in standard setting fora. You have systems like the mirror committees, which basically mirror what happens in international standardization bodies within the country so that they are faster when it comes to responding to developments that are made in the international arena. And these different strategies and the way how everything is combined really shows and is reflected on the rapid rise that China has had over the past roughly 2 decades in the main international fora. And that those are namely ISO, ITU, and IEC. I will not go into the details. Please have a look at the reports to know a bit more about those. But you see that their influence is growing. And that is made then in tandem with industrial policy. So if you look at Huawei, which has moved from a standards and industry and technology taker to really an innovator, you see that China has, for instance, to give one particular example, engaged in bilateral arrangements with over 50 countries in the world under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, which means that they can both convince other countries or engage with them on standardization, but also use the Belt and Road Initiative to allow Huawei to roll out their technologies. So this is really a combined effort in different fronts. If we compare that to Europe, unfortunately, we seem to be a little bit less attentive to the topic. This is I think, the sentence that you see on top is really showing the difference in approach towards standardization. You have functions related to standardization that are full-time jobs in China, but in Europe are considered side projects. Is what you do if you have nothing else to do. So that really makes a massive difference when it comes to the focus and to the importance that is attributed to standardization in Europe and more specifically in the Netherlands. This means that, or this is justified by, well, indeed, the part-time nature of standardization efforts in Europe, an underfunding of the standardization work, which requires trips to meetings, requires hotel bookings whose costs start to add up, and eventually you get to a situation where the European participation is not as active as it should be. A different element, but is also interesting in this context, is that we don't have a EU-wide mechanism, but maybe even, this is to be confirmed, national-wide mechanism to track or analyze the progress of China in standardization. So we hear the news every now and then about a breakthrough that has been made in some AI-related area, for instance, but it's more difficult to track the progress made within these international bodies. And that leads to a very reactive approach from the EU. We only know about things too late. And that means that we have a slower reaction, and also related to this situation, a fragmented representation in international bodies. We try to be on top of things, but because we don't have the people, which it depends also then on the money that we are investing on standardization, we don't always understand how Chinese get ahead in some areas. And this is then reflected in indeed the missed opportunity, which is engaging in the early stages of standardization development processes. This is a fundamental point to keep in mind. When things are up for voting in international bodies, it's too late. We can no longer influence the outcome, which is why we need more people to invest in the early phases of standardization processes so that we can actually have a say and influence the outcomes. We did have a look at two, we called it industry snapshots on telecommunications and the internet, and also EV chips, to have a look at how in practice the influence of China in traditionally Western countries-led organizations has been changing. And in any case, you see that China plays an increasingly important role in bodies like the 3GPP, which is a quasi-formal standardization body, but also at ITU, a formal standardization body. I leave the details about those differences to the report itself. But in any case, you see that there's a growing presence of Chinese experts in these bodies. The way how standards become geopolitical is very clear when you look at the new IP architecture proposal led by China back in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. The new IP architecture was a proposal put forward that would, if implemented, fundamentally change the way how the internet works towards a more authoritarian way of looking at the internet, how the internet would operate. So Huawei was in the lead, together with many other Chinese companies, to develop this new architecture that eventually did not get sufficient technical detail and political support. But in any case, it's an example of how China may want to use international bodies to technically, or via technical means, implement a certain worldview, in this case, on how the internet should work. So that's the link to the geopolitical elements. When it comes to electrical vehicle chips, one of the main findings is that, as with many other technologies, China looks at the topic from a vertically integrated approach. So China really wants to own the whole supply chain of EV chips and electrical vehicles at large in the country. So they have, for instance, the latest development is from 2024, the CA organization, which is the China Automotive Chips Alliance, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, it's Chinese only, so it doesn't allow for participation from others, which is a pointer to an element which is important here, the asymmetry of access to organizations from our end to, or the European end to China and vice versa. But it's an organization that essentially wants to develop the whole supply chain in China and use standards as a means to achieve that. And then the second element, the second bullet here, points to an important element as well, which is that we tend to look, and if you look at the CHIPS Act coming from the European Union, we tend to look at these topics as only from the very high-end tech point of view. We focus on the AI chips and the data centers and what's the technology of the future. Those are important, but mature chip nodes, like the ones that NXP here in the Netherlands develops, are also very, very important. And China is also trying to have a foothold on that front. The final section of the report focuses then on policy recommendations. So we call it a blueprint for action based on these 5 Ps. Programming, so making standardization a core pillar of industrial strategy, which is difficult because the fruits of this topic can only be collected at a much later stage than what we are used to. So investment in standardization is not about having something on your hands 2 years later. It's about building the knowledge and the influence over time. Promoting, meaning aligning our research and development and our investments indeed with standard setting, making, again, standards a core element of any investments made in technology. Protecting, for instance, by monitoring strategic shifts. I already mentioned how we have little overview about what China does in some of these bodies, but also guarding against asymmetrical access to these standard setting organizations. Partnering within the EU, making a better use of our European Union dialogues and making sure that we align what one country can do vis-a-vis what others can do, building coalitions of the willing and so on is quite important also in standardization. And then when it comes to process, I would highlight stakeholder inclusion, and I look forward to the panel to discuss to what extent SMEs, for instance, are excluded in part from standardization developments. Transparency is one of the big problems of international fora because documentation is only made available under certain circumstances, which can really limit, even if you like, democratic accountability. And then when it comes to early engagement, I will reiterate, we need to engage with standardization processes very early on. Otherwise, when it's already in the voting phases, it's too late. And this is what happens very, very often in practice. To finalize, we need patience. It takes time. It's not the kind of thing that you get your hands on within 1 or 2 years. And it requires sustained and long-term participation. And it's not the kind of thing where you drop a few millions and things got sorted. That's not the case at all with standardization. Prioritization is also important because we do have very limited resources. We have to focus on what is important for us. And that means, for instance, or might mean, up for discussion, in the Netherlands, looking at the semiconductor industry and consider to what extent we need to protect, so to say, our mature chips industry. But also means looking at what are the niches in high tech that we need to try to promote. And that means, for instance, quantum technologies, where the Netherlands is one of the leading countries in Europe when it comes to technology developments. And then finally, keep shaping global tech norms in line with our values. I refer again to the new IP proposal coming from China a few years ago and how that may be replicated in other areas that we are not even aware of because we don't have sufficient overview, sufficient knowledge about many of the developments that China does. I'll finish here. I'm happy to take questions later, and I very much look forward to the discussion, the panel that Maaike O'Connell-Wymans, my colleague, will moderate.